What we've done is we've deployed the enhanced victim recovery dog into the apartment, and by experience and the training of the dog, what I've first noticed is that as soon as I came in, that the dog's very excited, and as a handler I can pick up his body language, etc. And it would appear to me that as soon as he's come in the house, he's picked up a scent that he recognises. The second dog that we've seen work today is the crime-killing dog, Keela. She will only indicate to me when she's found human blood.
The room falls silent, every eye fixed on the enhanced victim recovery dog as he moves methodically through apartment 5A. Suddenly, Eddie freezes. His body goes rigid, his attention locked on a specific spot behind the sofa in the living room. The Portuguese detectives exchange glances. The dog's handler, Martin Grime, remains expressionless, but his eyes narrow slightly. This isn't just any alert. It's the first of 17 silent signals that would shatter the foundation of one of the most publicized missing person cases in modern history. This is not what anyone expected to find in the cheerful holiday apartment at the Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz, Portugal. Rewind to the evening of May 3rd, 2007. The sun had set over the picturesque coastal town, casting long shadows across the whitewashed vacation apartments. Inside apartment 5A, 3 young children slept peacefully, 2-year-old twins, Sean and Amelie, and their 3-year-old sister Madeleine, with her distinctive right eye where the pupil bled into the iris, creating a unique black fleck. Their parents, Kate and Jerry McCann, both physicians from Leicestershire, England, were enjoying dinner with 7 friends at the resort's tapas restaurant, roughly 180 feet away from their apartment. The adults had established a routine during their vacation, checking on their sleeping children every half hour while they dined together. At approximately 10 p.m., when Kate McCann entered apartment 5A for her check, she discovered Madeleine's bed empty. The bedroom window was open wider than they had left it. "They've taken her!" Kate's scream pierced the tranquil Portuguese night, launching what would become one of the most extensive and publicized missing person investigations in history. Within hours, the resort was swarming with police. By morning, Madeleine's face was splashed across newspapers worldwide. The story captivated global attention, an innocent child vanishing from her bed while on a family vacation, seemingly spirited away by an unknown abductor who had slipped in and out of the apartment like a ghost. The narrative seemed straightforward. A predator had seized an opportunity, taking advantage of an unlocked patio door to snatch a sleeping child. International search efforts mobilized, celebrities offered rewards. The Pope blessed a photograph of Madeleine. Her parents appeared on television programs across continents, pleading for their daughter's return. But what if everything we thought we knew about this case was wrong? 4 months after Madeleine's disappearance, when media attention had begun to wane and leads had grown cold, Portuguese investigators made a decision that would dramatically alter the trajectory of the case. They called in specialist search dogs from the United Kingdom, not the typical search and rescue dogs used to find missing persons, but dogs with a very different, very specific purpose. Eddie, trained to detect the scent of human decomposition, and Keela, specialized in identifying human blood, even microscopic traces invisible to the naked eye. These weren't ordinary canines. They were forensic tools with impeccable track records, deployed in hundreds of cases across multiple countries. What these 2 dogs would discover over the course of several days in early August 2007 would send shockwaves through the investigation. 17 distinct alerts, 17 moments where these highly trained animals indicated the presence of either human blood or cadaver scent, all connected to the McCann's apartment, their possessions, and a car they rented 24 days after Madeleine's disappearance. These silent signals would transform the investigation from a search for an abductor to something far more complex and disturbing. They would challenge the kidnapping narrative that had dominated headlines for months. They would turn the world's sympathy into suspicion, and they would plunge the case into a controversy that continues to this day. If you're fascinated by cases where the smallest details change everything, where a single alert from a specialized dog can unravel an entire narrative, hit that subscribe button now. because in this episode of Criminal Instinct, we're going to walk you through each of those 17 alerts and show you how they systematically dismantled the kidnapping theory that once seemed so certain. Praia da Luz sits like a postcard on Portugal's southern Algarve coast, a place where whitewashed buildings with terracotta roofs cascade toward turquoise waters. In spring 2007, this sleepy fishing village-turned-tourist haven represented everything a young family might want: safe streets, pristine beaches, and a relaxed atmosphere far removed from the pressures of professional life in Britain. The Ocean Club Resort blended seamlessly into this idyllic setting. Neither luxurious nor basic, it offered apartment-style accommodations spread across several blocks, with swimming pools, a tennis court, and childcare facilities. Apartment 5A sat on the corner of Block 5, a ground-floor unit with both a front door opening to the street and a rear patio door leading to a small garden area. From this patio, it was a short walk through a small gate and up a public street to reach the resort's tapas restaurant. Into this picture-perfect setting arrived the McCann family: Jerry, a cardiologist; Kate, a general practitioner who had scaled back to part-time work; and their 3 children: Madeleine, nearly 4, and 2-year-old twins, Sean and Amelie. They weren't alone. The McCanns had organized this week-long vacation with 7 friends, most of them also doctors with young children of their own. British media would later dub this group the Tapas 7: David and Fiona Payne, Diane Webster, Matthew and Rachel Oldfield, and Russell O'Brien and Jane Tanner. The group quickly established a routine. Mornings and afternoons were spent at the pool or beach. Their children attended the resort's kids club during parts of the day. In the evenings, after putting their children to bed, the adults would gather at the tapas restaurant for dinner around 8:30 p.m. This arrangement, leaving sleeping children in unlocked apartments while dining nearby, would later become a focal point of public criticism. But within the bubble of their vacation, it seemed reasonable to the group, who established a system of regular checks on all the children throughout their meals. On Thursday, May 3rd, their 5th night at the resort, this routine continued. The adults convened for dinner while 8 children slept in 3 separate apartments. According to statements later given to police, Jerry McCann checked on his 3 children at around 9:05 p.m., finding all asleep. At approximately 9:15 p.m., Jane Tanner, walking back to her apartment to check on her own child, claimed she saw a man carrying a sleeping child in pajamas walking across the road near the McCann's apartment, a sighting that would become controversial as the investigation progressed. At 9:30 p.m., Matthew Oldfield reportedly entered the McCann's apartment to check on their children, but stated he only listened at the bedroom door without actually seeing Madeleine. At 10:00 p.m. it was Kate's turn to check. She entered through the unlocked patio doors, noticed a breeze, and discovered the children's bedroom door open wider than she had left it. In the dim light, she could see the twins still asleep in their travel cribs, but Madeleine's bed was empty. What followed was chaos. Kate searched the apartment, then ran back to the restaurant screaming that Madeleine had been taken. Resort staff and guests mobilized into search parties, combing the grounds and nearby streets. Local police arrived around 11 p.m., though their response would later be criticized as slow and disorganized. By morning, the Polícia Judiciária, Portugal's criminal investigation police, had taken over, and the case was already making international headlines. The initial investigation focused squarely on the stranger abduction theory. Police conducted door-to-door inquiries, checked surveillance footage from nearby businesses, and interviewed resort staff and guests. Border controls were notified too late to be effective. The crime scene, apartment 5A, was not properly secured, with dozens of people walking through it in the hours and days after Madeleine's disappearance, potentially contaminating crucial evidence. As days passed without a breakthrough, the case captured global attention. The McCanns launched a media campaign unprecedented in scale for a missing person case. Celebrities including David Beckham, J.K. Rowling, and Richard Branson made appeals or offered rewards. The McCanns traveled to Berlin, Amsterdam, and Morocco to raise awareness. They even secured an audience with Pope Benedict XVI, who blessed a photograph of Madeleine. The image of 3-year-old Madeleine particularly those showing her distinctive right eye with its black fleck, became one of the most recognized faces in the world. Yellow ribbons, the international symbol of hope for missing persons, appeared across Europe. The Find Madeleine campaign raised millions in donations to fund private investigations and continued publicity. For the first 4 months, the narrative remained relatively unchallenged. An innocent child had been snatched by a predator who had spotted an opportunity and exploited it. The McCanns received overwhelming public sympathy as they maintained a constant media presence, always emphasizing their belief that Madeleine was still alive and could be found. Where were you when you first heard about Madeleine McCann's disappearance? It's one of those cases that seems to have etched itself into our collective memory, a moment when a private family tragedy became a shared global concern. Drop a comment below and let me know if you remember when this story first broke in your part of the world. By late July 2007, 4 months had passed since Madeleine's disappearance. The media circus had begun to quiet. Donations to the Find Madeleine Fund had plateaued. The Portuguese investigation, criticized for its initial handling of the case, needed a breakthrough. Behind the scenes, investigators were growing frustrated with the lack of progress and increasingly skeptical of the abduction narrative that had dominated headlines. It was at this critical juncture that the Polícia Judiciária made a decision that would permanently alter the trajectory of the investigation. They requested assistance from the UK police, specifically asking for the deployment of specialized search dogs, not to find Madeleine alive, but to search for evidence that might tell a different story about what happened in apartment 5A. Enter Martin Grime, a former South Yorkshire police officer who had become one of the world's foremost handlers of forensic search dogs. Grime arrived in Praia da Luz with 2 remarkable canines, Eddie, a 7-year-old Springer Spaniel trained as an enhanced victim recovery dog, EVRD, and Keela, a 3-year-old Springer Spaniel trained specifically to detect human blood. These weren't ordinary police dogs. They represented the cutting edge of forensic science, living, breathing detection tools with capabilities that surpassed the most advanced technology available at the time. Eddie was what's known in forensic circles as a cadaver dog. Trained to detect the specific volatile organic compounds released during human decomposition, he could identify the scent of human remains even years after death in minuscule quantities and through barriers like concrete, water, and soil. His training had exposed him to human remains in various stages of decomposition, from recently deceased to ancient burial sites. What made Eddie exceptional was his specificity. He was trained to alert only to human remains, not those of animals or other organic matter. Keela's abilities were even more specialized. As a CSI dog, she was trained to detect human blood, and only human blood, even in microscopic quantities invisible to the naked eye. Where traditional luminol testing might reveal blood that had been cleaned up, Keela could detect traces so minute they couldn't be seen even with chemical enhancement. More importantly, she wouldn't alert to animal blood, food products, or cleaning chemicals that might trigger false positives in conventional testing. The science behind these canine capabilities is nothing short of astonishing. A dog's sense of smell is estimated to be between 10,000 to 100,000 times more sensitive than a human's. Where humans have about 6 million olfactory receptors in their noses, dogs have up to 300 million. The part of a dog's brain devoted to analyzing smells is proportionally 40 times greater than ours. This extraordinary biological equipment allows trained dogs to detect scents at concentrations as low as 1 part per trillion, the equivalent of detecting a single drop of blood in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. They can also differentiate between scents in ways that even the most sophisticated laboratory equipment cannot match. While a gas chromatography machine might identify the chemical components of decomposition, a dog like Eddie can distinguish between human decomposition and that of other species, even when the chemical profiles are remarkably similar. The training process for dogs like Eddie and Keela is rigorous and highly specialized. It begins with selecting dogs that have the right temperament, high drive, good focus, and a strong play instinct. Training typically starts when the dogs are puppies and continues throughout their working lives. They're conditioned to associate their target scent, human decomposition for Eddie, human blood for Keela, with play and reward. Over time, the scent samples become increasingly diluted and hidden in more challenging locations, until the dogs can detect traces that would be impossible for humans to find without their assistance. By the time they arrived in Portugal, both Eddie and Keela had impressive track records. Eddie had worked on over 200 cases across multiple countries, helping to locate human remains in challenging environments from underwater to inside walls. According to police records, he had never given a false positive in a controlled setting. Keela had been deployed in numerous murder investigations in the UK, helping to identify blood evidence that had been cleaned up or was otherwise invisible. Her accuracy had been so impressive that UK police forces were paying up to $530 per day for her services. The decision to bring these specialized dogs to Portugal wasn't made lightly. It represented a significant shift in the investigation's focus. While publicly, authorities continued to support the abduction theory, behind the scenes, questions had begun to emerge. The lack of any confirmed sightings of an abductor, the absence of forensic evidence supporting a break-in, and inconsistencies in witness statements had led some investigators to consider alternative scenarios. The dogs would be deployed in a carefully controlled scientific manner. They would search not only apartment 5A but also several control apartments in the same block to establish baseline readings. They would examine the McCann's temporary villa, their rental car, and personal. Grime led Eddie away, then brought him back to the same area from a different direction. Again at the exact same spot, Eddie froze. The alert was clear, deliberate, and repeatable, three qualities that distinguish a trained response from random behavior. But Eddie wasn't finished with the living room. He moved to the curtains near the same sofa and alerted again, freezing in place, his attention fixed on the lower portion of the fabric. This was the second location in the same room where the cadaver dog had detected the scent of human decomposition. Eddie then moved to the McCann's bedroom. Inside the wardrobe area, in the corner of the room, he alerted for a third time. His body language was identical to his previous alerts: the sudden stillness, the focused attention, the rigid posture. The search continued to the exterior of the apartment. On the veranda outside the McCann's bedroom, Eddie alerted again. And finally, in the flower bed directly below that veranda, a fifth alert. 5 distinct locations, all within or immediately outside apartment 5A, where Eddie had detected the scent of human decomposition. The next day, Keela, the blood detection dog, was brought to the apartment. Her search focused on the exact locations where Eddie had alerted. Behind the sofa in the living room, Keela sat down, her trained response indicating she had detected human blood. This was remarkable. 2 different dogs, trained to detect different things, alerting in the same location. Keela also alerted to the curtains where Eddie had shown interest. Again, her trained response was clear and specific. She sat, indicating the presence of human blood in the same area where Eddie had detected decomposition scent. What makes these alerts particularly significant is what happened next. To validate the dog's responses and rule out the possibility of false positives, Grime and the Portuguese investigators conducted identical searches in 4 other apartments in the same block: 5B, 5D, 5H, and 4G. These control apartments had similar layouts, furnishings, and environmental conditions to 5A. The results? 0 alerts. In apartment after apartment, both Eddie and Keela moved through the rooms without showing any interest. No alerts behind sofas, on curtains, in wardrobes, or on verandas. The dog's behavior in these control apartments was markedly different from their behavior in 5A, strengthening the significance of their alerts. This pattern, alerts in 5A, no alerts in control environments, began to suggest something profound. Whatever the dogs were detecting was unique to the apartment where Madeleine had disappeared. It wasn't background contamination or environmental factors common to the resort. It was specific to that space. For the Portuguese investigators watching these searches unfold, the implications were becoming impossible to ignore. The abduction theory that had dominated the investigation for Months was being challenged by these silent signals from two highly trained animals. If human decomposition and blood were present in apartment 5A, particularly in multiple locations, how did that fit with the story of a stranger entering and quickly removing a living child? The tension within the investigation team was mounting. These weren't just random alerts. They were forming a pattern, a constellation of signals that pointed toward a narrative very different from the one that had captured global headlines. What's the weather like where you're watching from? Are you getting chills like I am? This case has a way of affecting people deeply, especially when you start examining the forensic details that didn't make it into most news reports. Drop a comment below about the weather in your location. I'm curious to see how far around the world this story reaches. The impact of the dog's alerts was immediate and seismic within the investigation team. Portuguese detective Gonçalo Amaral, who was leading the case, would later write in his book, The Truth of the Lie, that the dog evidence represented a turning point. The dogs don't lie, he noted. Their work is remarkable and reliable. For Amaral and his team, who had been struggling with the lack of evidence supporting an abduction, the dog's alerts provided a new direction, one that pointed uncomfortably toward the McCanns themselves. Behind closed doors, investigators began reassessing everything they thought they knew about the case. The timeline of May 3rd was scrutinized with fresh eyes. Witness statements were re-examined for inconsistencies. The focus shifted from looking outward for an unknown abductor to looking inward at the apartment and those who had access to it. Portuguese authorities didn't immediately share the dog's findings with the McCanns or the public. Instead, they continued the searches, expanding them to include the villa where the family was staying and a collection of vehicles, including one the McCanns had rented 24 days after Madeleine's disappearance. As we'll see in our next segment, what the dogs found in these additional searches only deepened investigators' suspicions. By early August, the investigation's direction had changed so dramatically that Portuguese police requested new interviews with the McCanns and their friends. These weren't the supportive conversations of grieving parents helping police find their missing daughter. They were tense, confrontational interviews aimed at probing inconsistencies and challenging the abduction narrative. On September 7, 2007, after nearly 10 hours of questioning, Kate McCann emerged from the police station in Portimão to face a crowd of reporters. The news was shocking. She had been named an arguida, a formal suspect in her daughter's disappearance. The following day, Jerry McCann was also given arguido status after his own lengthy interrogation. Under Portuguese law, being named an arguido grants certain legal protections, including the right to remain silent and to have an attorney present during questioning. But in the court of public opinion, the impact was devastating. The parents who had been portrayed as victims of an unimaginable tragedy were now being cast as potential perpetrators. According to reports from those close to the investigation, the decision to name the McCanns as suspects was directly linked to the dog evidence and subsequent forensic testing. Portuguese authorities believed they had enough to justify their suspicions. Cadaver scent in multiple locations connected to the McCanns, preliminary DNA results that seemed to support the dog's alerts, and what they perceived as inconsistencies in the McCanns' account of the evening. The media coverage shifted almost overnight. Headlines that had once read, "Parents' agony," now screamed, "Parents named as suspects." Newspapers that had championed the McCanns' search now published speculation about their possible involvement. The sympathetic interviews were replaced with hard-hitting questions about inconsistencies and contradictions. In Britain, where support for the McCanns had been strongest, the public reaction was mixed. Many continued to stand by the couple, viewing the Portuguese investigation as flawed and the dog evidence as unreliable. Others began to question the narrative they had accepted for months. Internet forums and early social media platforms buzzed with amateur sleuths dissecting every detail of the case, often focusing on the dog alerts as key evidence. The McCanns and their supporters fought back aggressively against the shifting narrative. Their legal team emphasized that dog alerts are not evidence on their own and require forensic confirmation. They pointed to cases where cadaver dogs had been wrong and stressed that no definitive forensic evidence had been found to corroborate the alerts. They suggested that the Portuguese police under pressure to solve the high-profile case, were making the McCanns scapegoats. Clarence Mitchell, the McCanns' spokesman, worked tirelessly to counter the negative press. "Kate and Jerry are 100% innocent," he told reporters. "They have nothing to hide." The couple themselves maintained their innocence, continuing to insist that Madeleine had been abducted and that the investigation's new direction was distracting from the search for their daughter. Despite the McCanns' protests, the investigation continued to focus on them throughout the fall of 2007. Portuguese police explored a theory that Madeleine had died accidentally in the apartment, perhaps from a fall or medication overdose, and that her parents had concealed her body and fabricated the abduction story. This theory, heavily influenced by the dog evidence, represented a complete reversal of the investigation's initial direction. The case had transformed from a straightforward search for a missing child and her abductor into something far more complex and controversial, a tangled web of forensic evidence, conflicting statements, media manipulation, and competing narratives. At the center of this transformation were those 17 dog alerts, silent signals that had redirected the entire investigation. For the detectives who had watched Eddie and Keela work, the alerts couldn't be ignored. For the McCanns and their supporters, the alerts were misleading, unreliable, or simply wrong. And for the public, increasingly divided in their opinions, the dog evidence became either damning proof or a dangerous distraction, depending on which narrative they found more convincing. This case has layers most people never hear about. Take a second to share this video to help others understand what really happened. The mainstream media coverage often glossed over the forensic details we're discussing today, but these are the elements that investigators found most compelling, the silent signals that changed everything. Following each of the dog's alerts, forensic teams meticulously collected samples for laboratory analysis. Swabs were taken from behind the sofa and from the curtains. Sections of flooring were carefully removed. The fabric of the Cuddle Cat toy was examined. Samples from the rental car were packaged and sealed. All of these materials were sent to the Forensic Science Service, FSS, in Birmingham, England, one of the world's leading forensic laboratories at the time. The expectations were high. If the dogs were correct, these samples should contain either traces of blood or decomposition products that could be linked to Madeleine through DNA analysis. The results, investigators hoped, would transform the dog's alerts from intelligence into evidence. What followed was a masterclass in the limitations of forensic science when pushed to its absolute limits. The FSS employed a technique called low copy number, LCN DNA analysis, a method designed to develop DNA profiles from samples containing only a few cells, far less than would be required for standard DNA testing. This cutting-edge approach amplified the DNA present in the samples through many more cycles than conventional methods, allowing scientists to detect genetic material that would otherwise be invisible. But this extreme sensitivity came with significant drawbacks. The more a DNA sample is amplified, the greater the risk of contamination and misinterpretation. Phenomena known as allelic drop-in and allelic drop-out can occur, where genetic markers appear or disappear randomly during the amplification process. The result can be partial or mixed DNA profiles that are difficult to interpret with certainty. In September 2007, preliminary results from the FSS seemed to support the dog's alerts. Portuguese police were told that samples from the rental car contained DNA that matched Madeleine's profile. This information, though not conclusive, contributed to the decision to name the McCanns as formal suspects. However, as the analysis continued and more rigorous standards were applied, the picture became less clear. The final report from the FSS, delivered in early 2008, was far more cautious. The DNA results were described as complex and inconclusive. The samples contained mixtures of DNA from multiple individuals, while some genetic markers consistent with Madeleine's DNA were present. The scientists could not definitively state that the DNA belonged to her. John Lowe, a forensic scientist at the FSS, summarized the findings in a now famous email to the Portuguese authorities. "The evidence we have now is not enough to support the hypothesis that Madeleine McCann's DNA is present in the samples we've received. This carefully worded statement acknowledged the presence of DNA that could be Madeleine's, but stopped short of confirming it, a crucial distinction in forensic science. The blood samples identified by Keela presented similar challenges. While tests confirmed the presence of human blood in some locations, the samples were too degraded or too small to yield complete DNA profiles. Without being able to definitively link the blood to Madeleine, the forensic value of these findings was limited. This outcome sparked an intense debate about the relationship between dog alerts and forensic evidence. Supporters of the McCanns pointed to the inconclusive laboratory results as proof that the dogs had been wrong. If Eddie had truly detected human decomposition and Keela had identified human blood, why couldn't the laboratory tests confirm these findings? Proponents of the dog's reliability offered several explanations. The samples might have been too degraded or too diluted for even advanced testing to confirm. Cleaning could have removed enough material to make laboratory confirmation impossible while leaving trace amounts that the dogs could still detect. Or the laboratory techniques, despite their sophistication, might simply not be as sensitive as a dog's nose. Martin Grime himself had always been clear about this limitation. In his report to Portuguese authorities, he emphasized that dog alerts are investigative tools, not evidence on their own. They indicate areas where forensic teams should focus their attention, but the alerts themselves must be corroborated by laboratory analysis before they can be considered proof. What time is it where you're watching? It's never too late to question what we think we know. This case reminds us that forensic science exists in a space between certainty and doubt, where even the most advanced techniques have limitations. Drop a comment with your local time. I'm curious to see when and where people are engaging with this complex case. In July 2008, 10 months after being named as formal suspects, Kate and Jerry McCann had their arguido status officially lifted. The Portuguese Attorney General's office released a statement declaring that the investigation had uncovered no evidence of any crime committed by the couple. The case was officially archived as an unsolved mystery, with authorities citing a lack of conclusive evidence to support any particular theory about what happened to Madeleine. The inconclusive forensic results had proven insufficient to sustain the suspicions raised by the dog's alerts. Without corroborating evidence, Portuguese authorities could not move forward with any charges against the McCanns or anyone else. The investigation that had once commanded global attention ended not with resolution, but with a question mark. The McCanns returned to the UK and continued their campaign to find Madeleine. They successfully sued several British newspapers for libel over stories suggesting their involvement in their daughter's disappearance, receiving substantial damages that were directed to the Find Madeleine Fund. They also published a book, Madeleine, detailing their experience and maintaining their belief that their daughter had been abducted and could still be alive. But the case refused to stay closed. Public interest remained intense, with the dog evidence in particular continuing to fuel debate. Online communities dedicated to analyzing the case grew, with the 17 alerts frequently cited as evidence that the official investigation had missed or dismissed crucial information. In 2011, following pressure from the McCanns and intervention by then Prime Minister David Cameron, Scotland Yard launched Operation Grange, a formal review of the case that later became a full investigation. With a budget eventually exceeding $11 million, British detectives re-examined all the evidence, including the controversial dog alerts. Operation Grange took a markedly different approach from the later stages of the Portuguese investigation. Rather than exploring the possibility that Madeleine had died in the apartment, British detectives focused almost exclusively on the abduction theory. They generated e-fits of potential suspects, investigated dozens of persons of interest, and followed leads across Europe. Critics of Operation Grange pointed to its narrow focus, questioning why the dog evidence that had so dramatically shifted the Portuguese investigation seemed to be downplayed or dismissed by British authorities. Supporters countered that the British investigation was simply following the most likely scenario based on all available evidence, including the inconclusive forensic results. In June 2020, the case took another dramatic turn when German prosecutors announced they were investigating a new suspect. Christian Brückner, a German national with a history of sexual offences who had been living in the Algarve at the time of Madeleine's disappearance. German authorities stated they believed Madeleine was dead and that Brückner was responsible, though they acknowledged they did not have enough evidence to charge him. This development introduced yet another narrative to the already complex case. If Brückner or another unknown abductor was responsible, how could the 17 dog alerts be explained? Supporters of the dog evidence suggested that perhaps Brückner had entered the apartment and harmed Madeleine there, accounting for the alerts in apartment 5A, though this wouldn't explain the alerts in locations like the rental car, which the McCanns didn't acquire until weeks after the disappearance. Others maintained that the dog alerts were simply wrong, false positives that had led the investigation astray. They pointed to the inconclusive forensic results and cases where cadaver dogs had alerted incorrectly. The McCanns themselves had suggested various explanations for the alerts, including the possibility that Eddie had detected scents from Jerry's tennis shoes or from Kate's contact with deceased patients in her work as a doctor. More than a decade and a half after Madeleine's disappearance, the 17 dog alerts remain one of the most controversial and divisive elements of the case. For some, they represent compelling evidence that the abduction theory is flawed. For others, they are a red herring that distracted from the search for a real abductor. The truth is that we still don't know what happened to Madeleine McCann. Despite one of the most extensive and expensive missing person investigations in history, despite the involvement of police forces from multiple countries, despite the global attention and the millions spent, we are left with competing theories and unresolved questions. What we do know is that 17 times, in locations connected to the McCanns and their missing daughter, highly trained dogs alerted to scents that shouldn't have been there according to the abduction narrative. These silent signals, whether accurate or misleading, fundamentally altered the course of the investigation and continue to influence how many people understand this case. The mystery of what happened in apartment 5A on May 3, 2007, remains unsolved. The dogs have long since retired from service. Martin Grime has moved on to other cases, but the questions raised by those 17 alerts continue to echo, reminding us that sometimes the most powerful evidence is the kind we can't see, only detect through the remarkable senses of animals trained to find what humans have missed or hidden. 17 alerts, 17 moments when highly trained animals indicated something that challenged the prevailing narrative. 17 silent signals that transformed a missing child case into one of the most complex and controversial investigations in criminal history. The story of the cadaver dogs in the Madeleine McCann case illustrates a fundamental tension in modern criminal investigation: the gap between what science can suggest and what the law can prove. Eddie and Keela, with their extraordinary biological capabilities, could detect scents at concentrations far below what laboratory equipment could confirm. Their alerts pointed investigators toward a narrative that many found compelling, but one that couldn't be substantiated to the standard required for legal proceedings. This gap between detection and confirmation, between intelligence and evidence, is where this case has remained suspended for over a decade and a half. It's a space filled with questions that may never be answered. If Eddie and Keela were correct in their alerts, how do we explain the lack of conclusive forensic confirmation? If they were wrong, how do we account for the specificity of their alerts, occurring only in locations connected to the McCanns and nowhere else? If Madeleine was abducted by a stranger, why would cadaver scent be present in the apartment and a car rented weeks later? If she wasn't abducted, what happened to her, and how was it concealed from the intense scrutiny that followed? These questions have fueled countless debates, books, documentaries, and online discussions. They've divided public opinion and polarized perspectives on the case. Some see the dog evidence as the key to understanding what really happened. Others view it as a distraction that derailed the investigation and unfairly implicated innocent parents already suffering an unimaginable loss. What's certain is that these 17 alerts fundamentally changed how the case was investigated and understood. They introduced doubt into a narrative that had initially seemed straightforward. They forced investigators, journalists, and the public to confront the possibility that the story they had accepted might not be the whole truth. The case reminds us of the limitations of both science and justice. Science, for all its power, sometimes leads us to thresholds it cannot cross, suggesting truths it cannot definitively prove. Justice, with its necessary standards of evidence, sometimes cannot act on what science suggests. Between these limitations, some truths remain elusive, some questions unanswered. It also reminds us of the extraordinary capabilities of animals like Eddie and Keela. These dogs, with their remarkable biological equipment and rigorous training, can detect what humans cannot see and what machines cannot measure. They represent a bridge between our world of visible evidence and an invisible realm of molecular traces, signals too faint for our perception but potentially crucial to understanding what has occurred. Perhaps most importantly, the story of the 17 alerts reminds us that truth in complex cases is rarely simple or absolute. It exists in layers, in nuances, in the spaces between competing narratives. It requires us to hold multiple possibilities in mind simultaneously, to acknowledge uncertainty, and to resist the temptation of easy answers. Madeleine McCann's disappearance remains unsolved. The 17 alerts that redirected the investigation remain neither definitively confirmed nor conclusively refuted. The tension between what the dog suggested and what forensic science could prove remains unresolved. And somewhere in that tension, in that space between detection and confirmation, between suggestion and proof, lies a truth about what happened in apartment 5A on the night of May 3rd, 2007. A truth that 17 silent signals pointed toward but could not, on their own, reveal. If you want more deep dives into the forensic details that mainstream coverage misses, subscribe now and hit that notification bell. Here on Criminal Instinct, we believe that understanding complex cases means examining the evidence that others overlook, the silent signals, the forensic nuances, the scientific details that often hold the key to what really happened. Join our community of critical thinkers who aren't satisfied with simplified narratives and who understand that sometimes the most important evidence is the kind that doesn't make headlines.